Well, good morning. Good to see you this morning. Thankful for those joining us online. If there are some deer hunters joining us online, I want you to know that at our staff prayer time, we prayed for you. Not going to say what we prayed. About 36 years ago, I had a deer hunter in the previous church I was in. I'm going to call him Doug because his name was Doug. I hope he's hearing this morning. Doug was a youth worker. Pretty faithful, good youth worker, but boy, when deer season came, when I moved to Arkansas, I remember the first year I was in Arkansas and I heard that there were this thing called deer days. Well, what is that? Well, it's serious. It's a religion here in Arkansas, isn't it? Doug would always take off a couple of Sundays around deer season, and I didn't give him a hard time about it, but one Sunday morning about 36 years ago, Doug was on his deer stand, and a big gust of wind came and blew him out of his deer stand. Injuries were minor, but when he came back the next week, he told me he would never hunt on a Sunday morning again. It's not what we prayed this morning. I'm just telling you a story, that's all. Just telling you a story. Now, I am thankful that many of the men in our church I know who are gone this week deer hunting at their deer camps, they do have a worship service on Sunday morning, and I'm thankful for that. As long as they continue to send their tithes and offerings here. I'm thankful for that. I need to jump in. Okay. The thread of redemption runs cover to cover through God's Word. And as we've seen in our study of Joseph, there are many pictures foreshadowing the coming of Christ and the work of redemption on our behalf. We've seen that in Joseph's brothers. They received grace. They've been treated with great mercy. They've been reconciled with Joseph. All their needs in these trips back and forth to Egypt were provided for. And now, as we saw last week, they were sent back to their father and their family. As they were sent back, they were to bring word about Joseph, the fact that Joseph was alive, the fact that Joseph wanted them to come near to him, that he'd provide for their needs if they would simply choose to make the move, to come from where they were to where Joseph was. We saw last week not only a picture of the gospel, but also a picture of our responsibility. Just as we have received the gospel message, been reconciled to God like Joseph's brothers, we're accountable to bring that word back to those who don't know God and to let them know that God desires all men to be reconciled to him. We saw last week in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we are ambassadors for Christ. And Paul said we're imploring men to be reconciled to God. So I want to take just a minute this morning before we jump into chapter 46. What does it mean practically to be an ambassador? What that means is if you're a follower of Christ, if you're truly a disciple of Christ, the job that you hold, the place that you're employed, you're not there simply because you made a decision to accept an offer that was extended to you. You're in the job you're in, and you're in that place of employment because God needed an ambassador there. Where you live, the home that you have rented or purchased in the neighborhood where you live is not because there's a particular floor plan of a house that you liked. It's not because there's a particular school zone you wanted to live in, a certain part of the city you wanted to live in. Where you live, if you're a true follower of Christ, you're in that neighborhood, you're in that place because God needed an ambassador in that neighborhood. If you're truly a follower of Christ, if you're his ambassador, you attend the school that you attend, not because of where you live, not because of school choice, but you're there because God needed an ambassador at that school. What I'm saying this morning is, linking back to last week, if you're truly a follower of Christ and you're seeking to obey him, you did not make any of those decisions lightly. If you're a committed follower of Christ, you understand that you are living out Ephesians 2:10. You're his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared in advance. Before you were even born, God prepared in advance the works that he had for you to do and the places that he would call you to be his ambassador. And so as you sought the Lord before you made those decisions, he put the desire in your heart that he wanted you to have so that you would make the decision that you have made, and those decisions, those choices would be pleasing to him, and he'd be able to place you where he needed an ambassador. That's what it means to be an ambassador. And so the question is, wherever you are you fulfilling your role as an ambassador of Christ? Are you representing him well? Are you speaking up and talking about his purpose and his reason for the place where you are? Now, you might be here this morning and say, well, Pastor, I have to be honest, I really didn't seek the Lord. I didn't think about serving him and being his ambassador, but I want to be obedient. I want to fulfill the calling that God's has on my life and to serve him well. Well, if that's where you are, if your admission this morning would be, well, I've not been an ambassador, but I want to be, then what should you do? Well, you should confess and repent. You should tell the Lord that you are sorrowful, that you're repentant over the fact you've not been faithful, and you should express your desire to be faithful to him as a follower, as an ambassador of Christ. What about repentance? Well, repentance means a turn or a change in direction. Maybe you're not in the place that the Lord would have placed you, not in the right work environment, not in the right neighborhood. Listen, I'm not telling you this morning to quit your job and sell your house. You don't need to do that unless and until the Lord gives you that instruction. What I'm saying this morning is, wherever you are, make the decision, in this place, I'm going to be his ambassador. I'm going to allow God to use me right where I am, however he chooses. And if he wants you to move, he's going to reveal that to you. If you'll simply make the decision to walk in obedience, he's going to give clear direction. So really for all of us this morning, even those who have really sought the Lord in where we are and where we work and where we live or where we're attending school, for all of us this morning, whether we've sought him or not, the key to being an effective ambassador is simply being faithful where you are, to consistently seek the Lord, to be obedient, and to walk by faith. That's what God calls us to do. Well, we're going to dive in Genesis 46 this morning. You'll remember that Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. He invited them with Jacob and along with the entire family to live with him in Egypt. The brothers returned to Canaan. They shared that news with Jacob. He couldn't believe his ears, and then he saw the provisions that Pharaoh and Joseph have sent. So now, after almost 25 years of believing that Joseph was dead, his spirit's been revived with the news that Joseph lives, and Joseph wants him to come, and he will see Joseph again. Now, Genesis 46, beginning in verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives, in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. You know, there are few folks who really thrive on and are energized by change. Most of us probably struggle with change a little bit more than others, but certainly as we get older, the tougher it is. In fact, if we're older, change often becomes something that we fear, something that we're resistful to. Why? Because we like our familiar surroundings. We like our familiar relationships. We like the things that make us comfortable and give us a feeling of confidence and even courage and control that makes us feel safe and content. Jacob is now 130 years old. He's lived with his family, all of his extended family surrounding him, lived in the area of Hebron for many, many years, and now the time has come to leave it all behind. God has promised to richly bless Jacob when he moves to Egypt. And so Jacob has a decision before him. For the final 17 years of his life, he has the opportunity to be with his son, his beloved son Joseph, be reunited, have his family close by. All of his needs are going to be met. He'll have no worries, no concerns. But like his grandfather Abraham, he has to follow the voice of God. He has to make the decision to leave his comfort and his comfortable surroundings behind. Let me put that into perspective for us a little bit today. Jacob lives to be 147. He's making this move at 130. That would be like someone today who is going to live to be 90 years old, making the decision at 81 to leave their home, to leave all their familiar surroundings, all their relationships, and move to another country with a different language and a vastly different culture, knowing that you were never going to return to your comfortable home environment and surroundings. That's kind of the equivalent of what Jacob was doing. So Jacob and his family leave Hebron, where they live. They travel for about a week and come to one of the southernmost towns in Canaan, the town of Beersheba. Now remember, he's 130 years old. It's taken a full week of hard travel just to get to the southern end of Canaan. Beersheba was a pretty special place for Jacob in his family history. His grandfather Abraham had dug a well there. Beersheba was a place where Abraham lived after he offered Isaac as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Jacob had actually lived in Beersheba with his father Isaac for many years. He'd heard stories of God's appearances at Beersheba, God's appearance to Hagar, and later God's appearance to Isaac there at Beersheba. And so Jacob stops at Beersheba on his way to Egypt, not just to reflect on old memories. In the last 130 years, Jacob has learned some pretty hard lessons about what it looks like when you aren't following God and when you aren't seeking God, when you aren't walking with God. So as he's starting out on this journey, before he leaves Canaan, he stops and builds an altar and offers sacrifices to the Lord. Since he's about to leave his own land, he wants to be sure that this is really what God would have him do and the direction that God was going to have him go. He wants to know that the move to Egypt is going to be accompanied, his nation, his people, his family will be accompanied by the presence and blessing of God. You have to admire this pause on the journey. He's certainly anxious to see Joseph. He's anxious to get to Egypt, to accept this invitation into a better situation, to be with Joseph again. It seems like the right thing to do humanly, but he wants to stop and offer sacrifice to the Lord and make sure that what he's doing is indeed pleasing to God and acceptable in his sight. Evidently, Jacob has some fear. We see in verse 3 that God told him not to be afraid. He's got some fear. Now, why would he have fear? Well, maybe he remembered that his grandfather Abraham, during another time of famine, went to Egypt without the instruction of God to go. While Abraham was in Egypt, he received a slave. He acquired a servant girl named Hagar, and that set into series a bunch of events, a series of events that led to hostilities that continue to be played out in the Middle East today. You know, the situation in the Middle East is quite complicated, but the root cause is very clear. And from the time of Abraham until Jesus comes, what you see being played out in the Middle East is the conflict between the sons of Israel and the sons of Ishmael. And it's never going to end until Jesus returns. So God appears to Jacob. We see here in chapter 46, he appears to Jacob at Beersheba. It's not the first time that Jacob has had God appear to him. You remember that Jacob, years before, was at Bethel, and the Lord came to him and reaffirmed the covenant he had made with his grandfather Abraham. The covenant that from Abraham and then through Isaac and now through Jacob, God was going to take this people and make a nation from them, a nation that would bless all nations. You see in verse 3, God assures Jacob that he is to move to Egypt. He says, do not be afraid. You know, God knows what's in our hearts. That can be comforting or that can be frightening, can't it? God knew that Jacob had some fear, and he tells Jacob, look, going to Egypt is part of my plan. It's there that I'm going to make your descendants into a great nation. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to bless you. You notice that God doesn't tell Jacob how long he's going to be there. He doesn't tell Jacob how large the nation would become. We know those things in hindsight. He didn't tell Jacob those things. Jacob simply had to trust him and make that move knowing that God would fulfill the promises. We know now they're going to spend 400 years in Egypt. And the first of those years, they would be there under the invitation of Pharaoh, under the protection of Pharaoh. They would have the very best that the land had to offer, but the time would come when they would suffer in cruel bondage to Egypt. But God was even going to use the suffering to mold them into the nation that he had called them to be. So God simply assures Jacob here that he's going to be with them in Egypt, and he's going to make Jacob's family a great nation. And you notice this one final assurance in verse 4. He lets Jacob know that Jacob's going to finish his journey in Egypt. He's going to die in Egypt, but his son Joseph would be by his side. It was Joseph who would close his eyes at the end of that journey. You know, Jacob's pause here is a great model for us as believers. Whether you're making a geographical move or a career move or any kind of move, if you're not seeking God, you can have some confusion and some uncertainty and even some discouragement. When we seek God and know it's His plan and His purpose, we have the assurance He's with us. So what that says for us is when we're going to make a move of any kind, we need to seek Him out. We need to listen carefully to His voice, and we need to ask, God, are you in this? Is this the path you have for me? Does this, what I'm feeling called to do, does this please you? You know, during the study of Joseph, we've said a lot of kind of hard things about Jacob, but right now you see that Jacob is acting like a man of great faith. And he's an example of what it looks like to walk with God. He's 130. Not afraid of the challenge. He's not afraid of leaving, not afraid of the journey, not afraid of readjusting his life, not afraid of adapting to a new culture and a new place. The risk and the challenges don't frighten him because God has told him, I will be with you. Well, if you look in verses 8 through 27, and we're not going to read the list, but it lists all the descendants of Jacob. And if you look, you'll see it's a list of males, not because the females are unimportant, but when a listing is made of households, it's made under the names of the male heads of house. Verse 15 does list Dinah, Jacob's only daughter. Verse 17 lists Sarah, one of his granddaughters. By the way, do you wonder why only one of the granddaughters is listed, why only one is mentioned? You want me to tell you why that is? You don't care? You want me to tell you why? I don't know. No idea why that's the only granddaughter that's listed. But in verses 8 through 27, here's the point. Here's the point of verses 8 through 27. All the persons belonging to Jacob, all of his descendants, went into Egypt. At this point, what you see listed in verses 8 through 27 represents the entire nation of Israel. When they leave Canaan, there will be no Israelites in Canaan. When they move into Egypt, they will be a nation within a nation. God had already begun the process of multiplying the descendants of Jacob, and He'd protected them and provided for them, and He'd kept them all together, so when the time comes to make this journey, they're all together. You know, some of Jacob's own family may not have realized that they were a special people to the Lord, that He had an important work for them to do as a nation. But this little band of migrants we read about here in verses 8 through 27 are going to become a great nation. And they're going to bless the entire earth as God's people. Historical scholars have estimated that Jacob made this move out of Canaan and into Egypt somewhere around 1876 BC. If you look and study the nation of Egypt in 1876 BC, they were very prosperous, very powerful. Egypt was a dominant international power. And so as Jacob and his descendants enter and make their way into Egypt, they're entering a world of great efficiency, a world of great beauty, of cultural magnificence. Just imagine as they're walking literally into the land of Egypt, they're seeing beautiful cities and prosperous people. Now imagine you're one of the Egyptians living in that beautiful city and a prosperous person, and you're out on your balcony one day and you look, and here come the Beverly Hillbillies. That had to be what it looked like. All these wagons piled high with all their goods. No granny on top. Maybe Jacob was on top in a rocker. I don't know. But here come Jacob and the hillbillies. Look down at verses 28 through 30. Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him into Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. There Joseph prepared his chariot and went to meet his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." Jacob has finally been reunited with Joseph, and he's able to see now the hand of God in all that has taken place. It's been more than 2 decades since Jacob knew that his son had been killed. He'd given him up for dead, and now he's reunited, and you see that Joseph embraces his loving father. Think about Joseph. At 17 years of age, he's taken away from his father. For all these years, he's missed him terribly, and now they stand looking into each other's eyes and weeping with joy. And Jacob says in verse 30, hey, I'm content now. I can die in peace because I've seen my son. And yet God gives him an additional 17 years with this son. And Joseph's dreams have come true. He's reunited with his family. They're going to share the joys and the sorrows of being together as an extended family. They're in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is the northeast part of the Nile Delta. It's very fertile. It's an excellent place for grazing livestock and growing crops. And you see in verses 31 to 34, Joseph gives instruction to his father and his brothers about how they should present themselves before Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh had already told them that he was going to let them settle in the best part of the land in Goshen. So it's really just a formality that his brother and fathers are appearing before Pharaoh, but it's an important formality. So we'll pick it up in chapter 47 and verse 1. Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen. And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds as our fathers were. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Now, what was Pharaoh's concern in asking about their occupation? Why was that important? Listen, it wasn't just about giving them the fertile land of Canaan. You may remember back in chapter 43 a couple of weeks ago when Joseph's brothers went to his home and the big feast was laid out and the Hebrews, Joseph's brothers, were situated at one table and all the Egyptians who worked in Joseph's house at another table, and Joseph at a table all his own. Why was that? Because the Egyptians were prejudiced against the Hebrews. They were dirty people, and they were especially prejudiced against shepherds, because shepherds were on the very bottom rung of the social ladder. No one would want to interact with them, and they were considered untouchable by the Egyptians. So because they were Hebrews, because they were shepherds, because they kept livestock, they're settled in the land of Goshen, because in the land of Goshen, they're going to be separated from the Egyptian people. Now listen to me. Pharaoh made the decision to settle them there, but it was God's sovereignty that brought that to pass. God worked through Pharaoh to give the Israelites a separate place in the land because Joseph's family, the Israelites, Jacob's family, needed to live separated from the worldly Egyptian system. The Egyptians were idolaters. They didn't worship the true God. And God did not want his people assimilated into Egyptian society and culture. So God put it on Pharaoh's heart to put them in the land of Goshen. Look in verse 7 through 10. Then Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. In other words, the other patriarchs lived much longer than I am and those who follow me. And Jacob, verse 10, blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. I'm sure Pharaoh was pretty anxious and excited about meeting Joseph's father because he probably heard much about Jacob from Joseph, and he knew how much Joseph's father meant to him. But I want you to see the first thing Jacob does when he comes into Pharaoh's presence is to bless Pharaoh. And the last thing he does in verse 10 when the interview is finished, he blesses Pharaoh again. You know, in the Hebrew culture, blessings were important. In the Hebrew culture, the greater person always blessed the lesser person. As powerful as Pharaoh was, as wealthy as Pharaoh was, as dominant as Pharaoh was, not just in Egypt, but on the international stage, despite all of his might and power, in the eyes of God, Jacob is the greater. And it's a good picture, too, of how we should treat those who don't know our God, how we should relate to them. We need to be willing to bless them and understand that God uses even leaders who don't walk with him. In verses 11 and 12, you see that Jacob is getting his family settled in the best of the land. He's taking care of all their needs. He's showing the people of Israel, the people of Jacob, great grace. I want you to think for just a moment about how the people of Jacob, how the nation of Israel is treated in our day. They're kicked around. They're kind of a pariah in the international community, constantly voted against in the United Nations, put down by virtually every nation except a handful. But listen, that's going to change. And it's probably going to change someday soon. Israel will no longer be a pariah and put down, but Israel will be preeminent and predominant as God fulfills the promises he has made to his people through the centuries. Verses 13 through 26, you see the remaining 5 years of the famine. The Egyptian people are becoming poorer and poorer. They've used all their money to buy grain. Now they're out of money. And so they sell their livestock to Pharaoh to get more grain. And finally, they sell their land. And they've even become servants of Pharaoh so that they can have food. That's what's happening to the Egyptian people. What about the small nation of Israel during this time? Look at verse 27. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. Look at this. And they gained possessions in it. And they were fruitful. And they multiplied greatly. God has promised to make them a great nation, and he's keeping his promise. Now, I'm sure there's times over the next 400 years when they then become enslaved and they're suffering. They wonder if God has forgotten them. They wonder if God is going to keep his promise. But remember, by the time they make the Exodus, led by Moses, those 70 Israelites who had immigrated to Egypt had become a nation of about 2 million people. God always keeps his promises. And God works in ways that are beyond our understanding, doesn't he? Here's the Pharaoh who was a pagan ruler who worshiped a multitude of false gods. He enslaved his own people during this famine, but the Lord worked in his heart and used him to care for Jacob and his family, the people of God. The same sovereign God is over our affairs today. God will guide those who are his people. He has a plan and a purpose. His promises will be kept. His will is going to be accomplished. No human authority can thwart the plans of God.